A map small enough to fit between two hands can hide a question too big to endure through the centuries without an answer. In a room at the British Museum in London rests an ancient clay tablet produced in Babylon some 2,600 years ago. Its surface is cracked, the lines are simple, and the symbols were engraved when empires were still being born on the banks of great rivers. Even so, that piece holds something extraordinary, the oldest known representation in the world. At the center of the drawing appears Babylon. Around it are cities, mountains, distant regions, and a great waterway, the Euphrates, the same river mentioned in the second chapter of Genesis. This geographical coincidence opens an uncomfortable door. What if the first chapters of the Bible aren't just describing symbolic settings, lost in a past impossible to locate? What if some of these places can still be searched for, measured, and even visited? This investigation begins where human history itself begins, in Eden. Genesis does not present the garden as a vision without coordinates. The text mentions regions, mineral riches, and 4 rivers. One of them is the Pishon, linked to the land of Havilah, where there was gold. Another is the Gihon, associated with the land of Cush. The third is the Tigris, which flowed toward Assyria. The fourth is the Euphrates. 2 of those names never disappeared. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers continue to flow through the Middle East. They originate in the mountainous region of present-day Turkey, traverse territories of Syria and Iraq, and continue towards the Persian Gulf. They are not rivers of legend. They exist, they carry boats, they irrigate crops, and they appear on any modern map. This narrows down the search, but doesn't solve the mystery, because Pishon and Gihon seem to have disappeared. For a long time, this absence led some to conclude that the description of Eden could never be associated with a real territory. But the landscape of the Middle East did not remain static. Rivers changed course, deserts advanced, valleys were buried, and entire regions disappeared beneath the waters after the end of the last ice age. That's when the satellites revealed something that eyes on the ground couldn't perceive. Beneath the sand of the Arabian Peninsula, researchers have identified the bed of an ancient large river. It flowed down from a region known since antiquity for its gold deposits and headed towards the Persian Gulf, approaching the area where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet. According to some scholars, this extinct river may correspond to the Pishon River. If this hypothesis is correct, Eden would not be hidden in a distant forest or on an unknown continent. It could have existed on an ancient fertile plain, now submerged by the waters of the Gulf, between southern Iraq and Iranian territory. But that's not the only proposal. Another line of research leads the investigation northward, toward the mountains of northwestern Iran. There, near the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, are ancient names for rivers and valleys that some researchers link to terms used in the biblical account. One theory searches for the garden where rivers end, the other one where they begin. None of these can be presented as a definitive conclusion. The biblical text provides references, but does not offer a modern coordinate. Archaeology offers clues, not a sign saying, Eden was here. Still, there's something that's hard to ignore. All seriously considered proposals point to the same large region, the arc of land between Mesopotamia, the mountains of Turkey and Iran, and the Persian Gulf. It is precisely there that some of the oldest known cities arose, such as Eridu, Uruk, and Ur. It was there that ancient peoples developed writing, built temples, and preserved their own memories of a primordial land of abundance. Eden remains inaccessible, perhaps because its rivers have changed, perhaps because the sea has covered its plains, perhaps because the biblical account itself wants to remind us that the way back could not be opened by human strength. But the garden is not detached from the void. It has neighbors, rivers, and a direction. And this direction leads to Mesopotamia, the land between rivers where civilization began to write its history. But Genesis doesn't stay in a garden for very long. After the fall, the violence, and a humanity that drifted further and further away from its creator, the waters covered the known world. For months, there were no cities, roads, or safe horizons, only a vessel carrying what remained of a family and a promise. Then, one day, something changed. The ark stopped moving, but the text doesn't say that she rested on a mountain called Ararat. He says he rested on the mountains of Ararat, and this difference, almost always ignored, leads us to the next point on the map, a region of dangerous borders, ancient traditions, and an ice-covered peak where men still search for traces of the greatest new beginning narrated in Genesis. For 150 days, the waters dominated the landscape. Mountains disappeared. Paths were erased. Everything that once served as a point of reference ceased to exist. Then, almost without fanfare, the text records a decisive change. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Not about a single peak, about a region. In the ancient world, Ararat was not just the name of a mountain. It was the designation of a vast territory, known in Assyrian records as Urartu, a kingdom that occupied areas of eastern present-day Turkey, Armenia, and lands near Iran. Fortresses, inscriptions, and cities of this kingdom have been excavated. Therefore, when Genesis locates the ark in the mountains of Ararat, it is pointing to a real mountain range. But within this region, there is a giant that dominates the entire horizon. Standing over 5,000 meters high, covered in snow for much of the year, and visible from enormous distances, Mount Ararat rises in the far east of Turkey. For centuries, Armenian traditions, travelers' accounts, and ancient texts have linked that mountain to the memory of Noah. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century, reported that inhabitants of the region still spoke of remains of the vessel. This testimony does not prove that the ark was there, but it reveals that the tradition was already ancient, long before modern expeditions. And they came. Explorers, researchers, military personnel, filmmakers, and adventurers have tried to find wood under the ice. Pilots reported seeing unusual shapes near the summit. Aerial photographs captured an elongated shape that became known as the Ararat anomaly. Further down, about 30 kilometers from the mountain, a natural formation resembling a boat began to attract investigation teams. The place became known as Durupinar. Some argue that soil measurements indicate regular structures beneath the surface. Others claim that everything can be explained by geological processes. To this day, no evidence has been conclusively recognized as part of Noah's Ark. The honest conclusion is simple. The biblical region can be located. The vessel cannot. But geography still holds a provocation. Mount Ararat is located at one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. Descending from its mountains, peoples could advance towards Asia, Europe, or the corridor leading to Africa. For a narrative about the restart of humanity from a single family, few places would be geographically as strategic. However, the new beginning did not remain at the top. The family grew, generations multiplied, and at some point, Noah's descendants came down from the mountains and found a vast plain in the land of Shinar. There, humanity made a decision. They didn't just want to build houses. They wanted to build a name for themselves. The plain of Shinar corresponds to the region of ancient Mesopotamia in the south of present-day Iraq. It was a fertile land, but almost devoid of stones. Therefore, its inhabitants developed an essential technology: bricks molded from clay and hardened by fire, joined together with natural bitumen. This was exactly the method described in the text of Genesis, and it was precisely this method that archaeologists found in the great towers of Mesopotamia. These structures were called ziggurats. They rose in successive platforms, like artificial mountains, erected on a flat plain. For ancient peoples, they functioned as symbolic links between heaven and earth. The Babel project was not born solely from engineering. It was born from ambition. "Let's make a name for ourselves," they said. The tower would be the visible monument of a humanity that wished to reach the heights without submitting to the one who was above it. In the ruins of ancient Babylon, near the present-day city of Hilla, archaeologists have identified the base of a massive tower called a Temenanki. Its name meant something like house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Babylonian texts describe it as a monumental construction with multiple levels and dimensions that would have impressed any traveler from the ancient world. Centuries later, Nebuchadnezzar restored this tower, but the inscriptions indicate that he did not believe he was creating something new. He was rebuilding a much older structure. Could Etemenanki be the Tower of Babel? It's impossible to say for sure. Other researchers point to Eridu, an even older city located on the same plain. There too existed a large ziggurat, and the Sumerians themselves considered Eridu one of the first cities in the world. The debate continues, Babylon or Eridu, but understand what is not in dispute. Both are located in Shinar. The uncertainty is not about the country, it's about the exact location on the plain. Today, where Etemenanki once stood, only foundations, marks on the ground, and a vast area partially submerged remain. The tower that was meant to immortalize the names of its builders ended up as a void, surrounded by ruins. Perhaps this is the most accurate image of Babel. The man tried to climb up, and it ended up leaving only a hole in the ground. From Eden to Ararat, and from Ararat to Shinar, the narrative's movement is revealing. God plants a garden and descends to meet man. After the flood, he offers a new beginning atop a mountain. But when humanity descends again to the plain, it decides to build its own ladder to heaven. Grace descends. Pride tries to rise. And between these two movements, human history begins to diverge. Languages become confused. People scatter. The grand collective narrative fragments into families, clans, and nations. Then the camera in Genesis changes direction. Instead of following all of humanity, the text focuses on a single house in one of the richest and most advanced cities of its time. There lived a man named Abram. He didn't live in a tent. He wasn't a rootless nomad. He was surrounded by commerce, temples, schools, and bustling streets, until he received a calling that would require him to abandon everything. It was only when the ruins of his city were uncovered by archaeology that the modern world began to understand the true magnitude of that sacrifice. Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a city so advanced that for centuries, many readers of the Bible did not understand what it meant to leave it behind. Ur was not a camp surrounded by sand. It was a metropolis. At the beginning of the 20th century, excavations led by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley removed tons of earth from an ancient mound in southern present-day Iraq. Beneath the ruins, an entire city emerged. Streets, temples, houses, tombs, luxury items, and thousands of tablets covered in cuneiform writing. The registrations confirmed the name of the place, Ur. In the era traditionally associated with the patriarchs, that city was among the great centers of the known world. Its inhabitants traded metals, fabrics, wood, and precious stones with distant regions. Scribes recorded contracts, payments, inheritances, and judicial decisions on clay. Children learned writing and mathematics in schools. Some houses had 2 stories, internal courtyards, and drainage systems. Abraham did not leave poverty behind in search of a better life. He gave up security, structure, and prestige for the sake of a promise he could not yet see fulfilled. Above the city rose the great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to Nana, the moon god. Its steps dominated the plain, a daily reminder of who organized the religion, the calendar, and the public life of that people. The Bible itself does not hide this environment. Centuries later, Joshua declared that the ancestors of Israel, including Terah, Abraham's father, served gods other than those of the Euphrates. This means that Abraham did not grow up surrounded by the faith that he would later represent. He was called from within paganism, in a city where everyone seemed to know which gods should be honored. A different voice summoned him to leave. The call offered no complete map. It promised no walls, palaces, or immediate recognition. God was telling Abram to leave his land, his kindred, and his father's house for a place that would be revealed to him later. It was an order with an incomplete destination, and that may have been the first great test of his faith. Abram had to walk before he knew the end of the road, but he did not set out alone. Terah gathered his family, took Abram, Sarai, and Lot, and began the journey toward the land of Canaan. The most likely route followed the course of the Euphrates to the northwest, avoiding the open desert and following the ancient trade routes. The caravan traveled for hundreds of kilometers. Then he stopped. The text says that they arrived in Haran and settled there. Few words, many years. Haran still exists in southeastern Turkey, near the border with Syria. Its name has remained largely unchanged for about 4 millennia. In the ancient world, it was an important caravan crossroads. Routes from Mesopotamia met there with paths leading to Syria, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean. The city's name itself was related to the idea of a road or journey. The family called for a walk, parked in a place called the Path. But there was something even more unsettling in Haran. Its main religious center was also dedicated to the moon god. The family traveled a great distance, leaving Ur and arriving in another city ruled by the same deity. The scenery had changed. The spiritual atmosphere, however, had not. One possible interpretation is that Terah began the journey but couldn't completely break with the world he had left behind. Haran offered the comfort of the familiar. It was distant enough to feel like a fresh start, but familiar enough not to require a complete break. And it was there that the years passed. The stated destination was Canaan. However, the family began to live as if the intermediate point were the final one. How many journeys end like this? Not because of a public fall, but because of a prolonged pause. The person doesn't return to where they came from, but neither do they arrive where they were called. They build a life along the way, and over time, come to call the waiting their destiny. Terah died in Haran. Only after that did Abram resume his journey. At 75 years old, he left behind yet another city, another house, and another layer of security. He took Sarai, Lot, their possessions, and the people who had joined the group. Now, however, he was no longer just following the family's lead. One word followed. The road to Canaan descended through ancient corridors, crossed territories dominated by unknown peoples, and led Abram to a land where he did not own even a field. God had promised to make him a great nation, but Sarai had no children. He had promised a land, but every hill already had inhabitants. The promise seemed to grow while human possibilities diminished. Nevertheless, Abram continued. Years later, Haran would reappear in his family's history. From there would come Rebekah, Isaac's wife. Jacob would flee there, escaping Esau's wrath. In that region, Jacob would work for 2 decades, marry Leah and Rachel, and see the birth of most of the children who would give rise to the tribes of Israel. The city where the journey almost stopped would paradoxically become a place of new beginnings. But before the promise could become a people, Abram would have to face famine, family conflicts, wars, and a long wait for a son. And one of his decisions would lead Lot to choose the most fertile plain his eyes could see. It seemed like the best land, abundant water, green pastures, prosperous cities. Lot did not yet know that beneath that plain lay the hidden soil of bitumen, salt, and sulfur. Nor did he know that the cities before him were about to become the greatest archaeological scar of Genesis. For 3 days, Abraham walked without knowing exactly where the journey would end. Ahead, a mountainous region. Next to them, 2 servants. On the donkey, the firewood for the sacrifice. And walking near him was Isaac, the son who had taken decades to be born. The text does not describe what Abraham felt during those days. It does not record his nights, his silences, or the questions he may have had to suppress. Out of fidelity to the account, we cannot say what was going through his mind, but we can measure the conflict. God had promised that Abraham's descendants would be established through Isaac. Now, the same God commanded him to take his son to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. The promise and the order seemed to be moving in opposite directions. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then he asked the servants to stay with the donkey. He said that he and the boy would worship and then return. The sentence is brief, but it carries extraordinary tension. We will return. The text of Hebrews, many centuries later, interprets this statement as evidence that Abraham believed God was powerful enough even to raise Isaac from the dead. Abraham didn't know how the promise would survive, but he believed that God would not fail to fulfill it. He placed the firewood on his son's shoulders. He carried the fire and the cleaver in his own hands, and the two continued on together. It was then that Isaac broke the silence. "My father," Abraham replied. "Here I am, my son." The boy had realized that something was missing. There was fire, there was wood, but there was no animal. "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham offered no explanation. He simply said that God would provide the lamb for himself. The answer did not eliminate the mystery. It merely placed the burden of the solution on the character of God. When they arrived at the designated place, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac. The biblical narrative doesn't turn that moment into a spectacle. It doesn't describe resistance, shouting, or unnecessary violence. Everything happens with a sobriety that makes the scene even more difficult. Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the cleaver, and, just when the promise seemed about to disappear, a voice called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." The same response came up again, "Here I am." The order was interrupted. Abraham wasn't to harm the boy. The test had revealed that he would not put even his son above God. Then something that was already in the mountain came into play. Behind Abraham, a ram was caught by its horns in a bush. The provision didn't arrive when he raised the knife. The animal was already there. Abraham simply saw it at the appointed moment. The ram was offered in place of Isaac. The son came down alive. So Abraham gave that place a new name. The Lord will provide. But the following sentence points to something even bigger. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. It wasn't just a reminder of past provision. It was a declaration looking toward the future. That mountain would still be linked to the place where God would provide something. And this is where the geography of Genesis connects with the rest of the Bible. Centuries later, the second book of Chronicles records that Solomon began building the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. The location is not suggested by some distant tradition. It is stated in the biblical text itself. Moriah became the Temple Mount. The place where Abraham erected an altar became the center of Israel's worship. Sacrifices would be offered there. Priests would serve there. The blood of animals would continually remind them that sin brings death and that reconciliation requires substitution. On the same hill, where a ram died in place of a son, thousands of other animals would symbolically die in place of the people. But none of them would be the definitive solution. Today, the site associated with Mount Moriah is in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem. It is one of the most well-known and contested areas on the planet. Jews call it the Temple Mount. For Muslims, it is part of the noble sanctuary. Above the platform is the Dome of the Rock, built in the late 7th century. Beneath its golden dome lies a natural rock formation that religious traditions associate with events related to Abraham. Archaeology cannot carry out ordinary excavations at that site. Political and religious sensitivity makes any intervention extremely delicate. Even so, the surrounding areas have revealed structures from the Second Temple period, ancient streets, reservoirs, tunnels, and large retaining walls. Among them is the Western Wall. It was not a wall of the temple building itself, but part of the immense platform enlarged during Herod's reign. Some of the stones used in the construction weigh tens, perhaps hundreds of tons. The mountain mentioned in Genesis 22 did not disappear. It has a city surrounding it, visitors every day, and centuries of conflict etched into its stones. But the meaning of Moriah is not limited to the temple. The mountainous region of Jerusalem forms a long elevation. At some point nearby, outside the ancient walls, another son would climb up, carrying wood on his shoulders. Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice. Jesus carried the cross. Isaac asked where the lamb was. John the Baptist introduced Jesus, saying, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." In the story of Abraham, the hand was restrained. At Calvary, the sacrifice reached its ultimate conclusion. It is important not to confuse the locations, as if the Bible stated that the temple and the place of crucifixion occupied exactly the same spot. What the text allows us to perceive is a theological and geographical connection within the region of Jerusalem. Moriah announces provision. The temple transforms this provision into a system of sacrifices, and Christ presents himself as its ultimate fulfillment. Abraham had told Isaac that God would provide the lamb for him. Centuries later, the gospel declares that God gave his own son. Therefore, Moriah is different from all the places visited so far. Eden speaks of a lost entrance, Babel from an interrupted project, Sodom of an irreversible judgment. Moriah speaks of replacement. Someone was supposed to die there, but another took their place. This pattern runs throughout Scripture. An animal covered the shame after the fall. A lamb protected the homes in Egypt. Sacrifices were offered in the temple, until provision ceased to be a shadow and gained a face. But one last question remains. What happens when we put the 7 seats side by side? A garden possibly hidden by the waters. A mountain linked to new beginnings. A tower reduced to its foundations. A city abandoned because of a promise. A crossroads where the journey almost stopped. A valley transformed into a warning, and a hill whose name declares that God will provide. These places are not just part of a Middle Eastern itinerary. Together, they tell a single story. And when we observe the state in which each one has arrived up to the present, a message begins to emerge from the landscape itself. A message about what man builds, what God promises, and what truly remains as the centuries pass. We have reached the end of the journey, but perhaps this is the first time that the 7 places of Genesis can be seen as a single map. When we look at each of them in isolation, we find familiar stories. The Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark, the Tower of Babel, the calling of Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah, Mount Moriah. However, when we connect all these dots, a much larger narrative emerges. It's as if geography itself were telling the story of the relationship between God and humanity. Eden represents a perfect beginning. There were no walls, temples, or cities there. There was only communion. God walked with man, and creation reflected the harmony for which it had been formed. But disobedience blocked the way. The garden entrance has disappeared from history, and no generation has been able to find it again. Then came Ararat. When all hope seemed to have been swallowed by the waters, a mountain became a symbol of a new beginning. From it, a single family descended to rebuild the world. It was an opportunity to start over, but history followed the same course. On the plain of Shinar, man decided to build a tower to reach heaven through his own merits. He wasn't seeking God. He was seeking fame, autonomy, and power. Today, only buried foundations remain of the Grand Babel. The monument built to immortalize the name of its architects has disappeared. Then, the narrative changes scale completely. Instead of speaking of entire peoples, God calls a single man. Abraham leaves Ur. He abandons one of the most developed cities in the ancient world to follow an unseen promise. He did not receive a detailed map. He only received one direction. Biblical faith has never been about walking the walk, because everything is clear. He went for a walk because God told him to. Next comes Haran, perhaps the place most similar to the experience of many people. That wasn't the starting point. It wasn't destiny either. It was the halfway point. There, the journey almost ended prematurely. Haran reminds us that there is a very silent type of stagnation. It's not an open rebellion. It's simply about stopping moving forward. It's about getting used to a life comfortable enough to forget the promise. How often does this happen to us? We started full of conviction. We are taking the first steps. But over time, we built our own Haran. We postponed decisions. We postponed changes. We accept living only partially what God has called us to live. Then the narrative descends to the Jordan Valley. Sodom seemed to be thriving. Its streets were full. Their economy was functioning. Its inhabitants believed that nothing could shake that stability, but appearances concealed a deep corruption. When judgment came, everything that seemed permanent disappeared in a few hours. The cities disappeared. Pride remained only as a memory. Jesus looked back on this episode centuries later and made an extremely short request. Remember Lot's wife, because there is a danger that spans all generations. The danger of physically leaving a place while your heart remains attached to it. Then we arrive at the final scenario, Moriah, the mountain where Abraham discovered that God always sees what we are unable to see. When Isaac asked where the lamb was, no human answer could resolve the situation. The solution was already prepared. The provisions were on the mountain before Abraham arrived. This truth continues to resonate through the centuries. We often imagine that God only began to act when our circumstances changed, but the Bible often presents a different picture. While we were still walking without answers, God was already preparing what would be revealed in due time. Perhaps that is precisely why Moriah concludes this journey, not with destruction, not with ruins, but with hope. Now observe something extraordinary. Eden speaks of the loss of communion. Ararat speaks of a new beginning. Babel reveals the failure of human pride. Ur demonstrates the call of faith. Haran denounces the danger of complacency. Sodom serves as a reminder that no civilization endures when it completely rejects justice. Moriah announces that God continues to provide a way. It's not just 7 places. There are 7 stages in the history of redemption. And there's a detail that becomes even more impressive when we look at the current map. For a long time, many people imagined that the first chapters of Genesis belonged only to the realm of imagination. However, the more archaeologists excavated the Middle East, the more cities emerged from the sand. Ur appeared. Babylon appeared. Haran remained inhabited. The mountains of Ararat continue to dominate the horizon. Jerusalem remains one of the most studied cities on the planet. Not all questions received definitive answers. Eden remains the subject of investigation. The exact location of the ark remains unknown. Sodom still sparks debate among researchers, and it's important to recognize that. The Christian faith does not depend on transforming hypotheses into certainties. It grows when it honestly distinguishes between what the Bible affirms, what archaeology confirms, and what remains a possibility for research. This difference does not weaken faith. On the contrary, it shows that the truth doesn't need exaggeration to remain strong. Perhaps the greatest discovery of this journey will not be finding a lost garden or locating an ancient tower. Perhaps it is realizing that God has always chosen to act within history. He called real people. He spoke of real cities. He guided men and women along royal roads. Biblical faith has never been separate from the world. She always walked on the dust of the same roads that still exist. And that brings us to the last question. After crossing Eden, Ararat, Babel, Ur, Haran, Sodom, and Moriah, where does your story fit in? Perhaps you are experiencing a moment similar to Haran, caught between your calling and your destiny. Perhaps you are facing a difficult climb like Abraham on Moriah. Or perhaps, without realizing it, you are building a small Babel within your own heart, trying to achieve security solely through your own strength. Regardless of where you are, one truth runs throughout the entire book of Genesis. Empires have changed. The kings disappeared. Entire civilizations have been buried by time. But the one who called Abraham continues to fulfill his promises. Human maps have been redrawn countless times throughout the millennia. Borders have changed. Nations have risen and fallen. However, God's map never lost its way. It continues to be traced generation after generation. And perhaps, at this very moment, the next point on that map isn't a mountain in Turkey, a plain in Iraq, or a hill in Jerusalem. Perhaps this is where you are right now, because the same voice that once called Abraham to go forth continues to call men and women to walk by faith. And, as has been the case from the beginning, those who respond to this call discover that God never abandons those who decide to follow in his footsteps.